It could not. It could not have happened. Slavery was the largest economic interest in the country. Maybe $1 trillion by today's standards. Worth more than all the railroads and banks and factories of the North combined. And having that be destroyed is impossible, but it happened. Yes?
More than the railroads and banks at the time?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So more than all. So people talk about it was just wealth overwhelming agriculture, but slavery was where the real money was. The richest Americans were all white Southerners. If you owned just 2 slaves and nothing else, you were richer than the average person in the North. Wages for white people were higher in the South than in the North. Why did the South not industrialize? Because it was putting all its money into the guaranteed return. If you grow cotton or you grow people, why risk anything on building a factory or something? You've already got a monopoly. So I will pause here and see if there's another question. Yes? Yeah.
When I first ran into Reed Pearson's book, Battle Cry Freedom,
Yep.
I was real excited because he started in the 1600s, I think, explaining the economic history of our
Yep.
country and the South's development and how we agriculturally got, as you did last week, how we found ourselves stumbling into this need. And he brings it forward. I think the book doesn't use the word Lincoln for 200 pages. So he's doing a good job with the preamble to this problem. As I read the book, I kept seeking for something. I'd like you to help me find.
All right. I
I was looking for the moment, the opportunity for wisdom and political savvy to stop this madness. And I read the book intently seeking for this solution or this golden moment. But instead I end up with Butler leaving the House of Representatives, walking on the floor of the Senate and beating an abolitionist from Massachusetts with his cane 50 times. So the senator is unconscious. And then leaving the Senate floor, Butler walks away absconded. How does that happen on the Senate floor? And it does seem like things are getting out of control.
Well, Americans talked themselves into the Civil War. Nobody's forcing us to fight a civil war. Lincoln says later, for the amount the war cost, they could have bought every single slave in the United States. We tell ourselves, you know, Ken Burns' series, it was like an adolescent crisis of a nation coming of age. That's a very cheerful perspective on it, okay? This country is so fortunate that the war ended slavery. And any generation that was not that generation is so fortunate that they paid the price for all that sin that had accrued up to that point. If you want to look back and be alarmed, see the way that the white North and the white South completely ignored what the other side was really saying and kept drawing lines and saying, well, they're not going to step across that. And once we've drawn that line, then we have to defend it. And time after time, they took one step closer. So let's picture this. You got all these different states, and they are slave states and non-slave states, but different interests. But you have 4 political parties in 1860 scrambling all the vote. But what happens is that time after time, things are reduced to a binary choice. And that's what the Confederacy was trying to do with Virginia. Are you with us or against us? Are you in or out? And South Carolina and Georgia were very shrewd in doing that. Virginia says, I don't want to be either one. I want to work it out. But they arrange it so you have no choice but to choose sides. And that's why Lincoln calling for the troops was the trigger. He's not trying to. Lincoln's mistake is he had too much faith in the white South. He believed, how could people vote for these delegates to Virginia's Constitutional Convention for the Union and then Virginia leave? How could Virginia write the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and fight the war with Mexico and be the overwhelming number at West Point, the most patriotic Americans, and then leave? How could Robert E. Lee be offered the head of the United States Army and then leave? How could people who don't own slaves sacrifice their sons for an economic interest they do not share? Those were all the calculations that Lincoln made, is that the white South would divide. and that people of good sense would step up and bring compromise. And that's what Virginia thought it was doing. But here's the paradox. In the same way that Lee goes from being a leading United States general to a leading Confederate general, so does Virginia go from being the most reluctant Confederates to being the capital of the Confederacy and the home of the leading generals and the place that's devastated the most and the caretaker of the memory of the lost cause for 150 years later. So it's not a straight line. I'll get you 1 second. It's not a straight line. If Jim and I disagree in any way, is that he does believe that it's a conflict between a modern North and a non-modern South. And it's just not the case. The South was modern in a scary way in terms of literacy, voting participation, industrialization, it being railroads. It was two modern nations that went to war. It was not the past and the future, which we would like to tell ourselves. Okay. Yes?
My 12-year-old granddaughter goes to Temple Middle School right now.
Right.
She came home several weeks ago and told me her teacher said the Civil War was not fought over slavery. What is your assessment of the education in this area in the public schools?
That's all the time we have for. See, and this is kind of what I was getting at the beginning. Okay? So if you say, no, it was fought over slavery. Well, if that's the case, why was it Lincoln actually talking about ending slavery? Well, no. Was it the express purpose of the United States Army to destroy slavery in 1861? Well, no. Right? So that's why I'm pointing out how it's a story that's unfolding rather than just like these big slabs of a self-righteous North and a sinful South. Instead, it was two deeply ambivalent countries, and everybody, by our standards today, would have been racist in the sense of what they believed that people were really like, right? So that's the reason that we have to have the courage to relax the story a little bit and to say it became a war against slavery, which is kind of the story I've been trying to tell, right? And so if the choice is, and I was writing an essay about all this called What Caused the Civil War, and my daughter, who was in the 4th grade at the time, and I'm not making this up, I'm in church for one reason. My daughter walks in with her textbook, and she says, "Daddy, what caused the Civil War?" I said, "Slavery." 4th grade, if you have to say one word, the word that's confusing is, or the question, what, like there's one thing, caused, like it's billiard balls crashing into each other, the Civil War, as if we know what the next 4 years are going to bring. Every single word in that, including the, are misleading, right? You have to say, wait, let's look at it and see, the war was not about anything else. You can say that. But it did not begin slavery. This is another little formula I have. Like one formula, the white South did not fight for slavery, it fought for a nation based on slavery. Here's the other one. The North did not go to war to end slavery, but the South did go to war to defend it.
But how is that being taught in our
Well, apparently not well. But I would say this. SOLs, I think, tell it right. I don't think that it's the state policy or anything to mislead people, as it was for a long time. But trying to find the language to explain, first of all, slavery to young people is really hard, much less something like the gravity of the war, much less the way that history is not on railroad tracks, but is just like running cross country, right? The fact that we cannot predict today what's going to happen tomorrow, and we all acknowledge that right now. Imagine something far more profound than anything we're seeing today. The future of the nation and the future of slavery. So if you have to say one word, you can say slavery, but in other words, what you want to say is that, well, you have to talk about when you're talking about. And if you want to tell the McPherson story, the good one, is that over the course of the war, the best of America rose to the surface and did destroy slavery and did put the country back together. Problem with that is that it's easy to stop at the end of the story and forget how hard it was for us to get there and how many. Now, here's another fact. The same percentage of white men voted for Abraham Lincoln in 1864 as voted for him in 1860. Nearly half of all northern white men would not vote for Abraham Lincoln after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the fall of Atlanta, after Gettysburg, after the Gettysburg Address. Nearly half of white northern men won't vote for Abraham Lincoln. Okay? So that's how people can say it was not fought over slavery, because if we're imagining that all white northerners were abolitionists, we're fooling ourselves. 2% of people before, white people in the North before the war would have identified as abolitionists. And they were mainly women. Okay? So that's the thing, is that everybody needs to get over themselves in this. Now really, we need to come to it and looking for a quick answer to these things. You know, why would we think that something as complex as the Civil War would fit on a bumper sticker? That some saying is going to put it to rest. It's not. It's never going to be. We're never going to be at ease with this. And matter of fact, we shouldn't want to be at ease with it. We should want to understand what a struggle and how fortunate it was, and in some ways how unlikely it was. So that's what I would want the teachers to say. Hey kids, look, this is really complicated. There was a big conflict over slavery. Slavery was this great sin at the heart of American history, but it was not easy to get rid of it, and people didn't know how to. And that Abraham Lincoln did not know at the beginning, but he was able to hold the North together long enough that the war could be won, and when the war was won, slavery ended. Now that didn't solve what we'll talk a little bit as soon as I answer the next question about what happens afterwards. But okay, so that's, people are doing their best. I work with teachers a lot. It's easy to teach high school kids, college kids or adults, but what are you supposed to say to somebody who's 11? You know, I don't know. In the same way that we teach about, you know, our bodies. It has to unfurl over time. In some ways, teaching about this tragic history, we have to do it with care and not settle for cheap answers. Okay? I saw another hand. Yes, sir.
Indentured servitude. What is the legacy, of that? Indentured servitude, did it end at the Civil War, and were those contracts honored, or what?
Yeah, indentured servitude had basically faded away by the time of the American Revolution and replaced with chattel slavery. Okay? So, yes?
Just a quick question. I don't mean
That's right.
digress.
That's right.
Could you speak for just a minute about how political leaders, either northern and southern, reconcile or fail to reconcile their spirituality, their Christian belief with?
Yeah, the Confederacy says we are creating the most Christian nation on the face of the earth. They pride themselves on, you know the legend of Lee and Jackson, right? Of profoundly Christian men, unlike Abraham Lincoln, who does not belong to a church, right? And Grant, who's profane, and Sherman, who's profane. So the story of the Confederacy was we were the true Christians. Okay. How could they say that? Well, we talked about it last time. They could say, the Bible enjoins us to be good masters. That's what we believe in, that we will nurture the people put in our charge by God in slavery. That was the story they told themselves. So Lincoln says famously in his second inaugural, we worship the same God. And after every battle, both sides pleaded for his blessing. And after every defeat, people could say, well, maybe we're like the children of Israel. Maybe we're being tested. Maybe this is the way God would show that he actually does love us, to put us through the trial to see how we will respond. And after losses too, Jefferson Davis, again in the language of Christianity, says we will have days of feasting, of fasting, and of repentance. And to recognize that why are we losing? We're losing because of our pride. That we have put the things of this world above the things of heaven. The North uses exactly the same language. You have two nations that are completely saturated in the language and self-understanding and motivations of Christianity in this war. And there's a famous line by a historian that says, if you took the letters of Northern soldiers and Southern soldiers and threw them up in the air and then picked them up, you wouldn't be able to tell which was which. That's not literally true, but one commonality would be their constant questing for religious faith in the eyes of things that they're seeing. And you would see that they love their families, their mothers. Okay? But Christianity is foundational to both sides. And the South, one reason you have the lost cause, and one reason you have the statues and all this, is that the South understands itself to have fought a war by the highest standards of Christian morality and had lost. Therefore, it must have been God's will. It was a lost cause, but there was nothing to be ashamed of. That's the deal that the people who maintained the memory of the war after had, is that we fought honorably and we fought as Christian soldiers. Okay? So that's kind of a longer answer, but it's a profound question, and it's important to understand that that's the only way that people could sustain themselves, to say we're losing, but this must be a trial. This must be to show, for us to show the world that we are better Christians than they are. And so that's why it was such a crisis when the South loses. What does this mean? Does this mean we have lost God's favor? Does this mean we have betrayed the covenant? Does this mean that we were not good Christians? And the White South says, no, it does not mean those things. It means it was God's will that slavery come to an end. And Abraham Lincoln says these things in his famous second inaugural. And one of the great things that he said, it must have been the will of providence. He doesn't speak much of the language of Christian God, but he does speak of providence. By this is what he means. It must have been God's will that we bled enough in this war to make up for the blood that was shed in slavery, for the bondsman's lash. He doesn't say the North was the righteous people and the South were sinful. He says it must have been God's will that we repaid all the suffering that we conspired as a nation to inflict on these 4 million innocent people for 2.5 centuries. It must have been an atonement. It must have been a bleeding until we have repaid that debt. To come up and to speak in terms of shared responsibility and of humility and with modesty in the eyes of God, and to say that the North is to blame too, who else would have done that? After you had seen so much suffering, that the North says, we're complete victims in this. We're just sitting there minding our own business. You tried to leave the United States. We tried to hold it together. But he says, at that moment of victory, no, this was our burden too. This was our responsibility too. This was our debt too. And maybe we have paid it now. But it took Lincoln the whole war to come to that point of view. It took Lincoln to lower himself in his own eyes and to believe that this must be God's will. And it's my responsibility then to see it through. So what happens then when at Appomattox, 4 years after the war begins, all those people dead, 3.5 million people in slavery never coming within sight of the Union Army. It's important to remember. Virginia is where enslaved people in the Union Army interacted the most, in which enslaved people joined the United States Army. 200,000, and we're out of time almost, but let me just leave you with this thought. Of all the miracles in American history, think of this. 200,000 African-American men, the great majority of them held in slavery before, fight and die to protect the United States. After the Constitution, after all the bargains, after the complicity that Lincoln talks to, where does a loyalty to this country come from after that? And the same loyalty that then feeds into black men fighting World War I than black men and women in World War II, than all the armies, all the wars since. Where does that loyalty to this country come from? What love could hold that loyalty to this country together? I saw a hand, but I'm not going to answer it because we're out of time. I'm sorry. But that's a question we'll talk about next time, about Virginia, which followed this strange path and tragic path through the war, then follows a very unusual path through Reconstruction and back out the other side. So Virginia is simultaneously the most southern of states and a state that somehow has never really thought of itself as southern. And it doesn't fit the pattern very much again. So I am very attuned to body language, so I'm guessing that Rosalind maybe that's something to say. So thanks very much.